Hello, my name is Anubandh KATÉ. I'm a Paris-based engineer, and today I have a great pleasure to invite and talk to Professor Laurent GAYER of SciencePo. Welcome, Laurent.
Welcome. Thank you.
I don't know, Laurent, if you believe in this, but often Parisians and French people call Paris as the center of the world. And I tend to agree with them because the kind of research work that's been done here on Southeast Asia, including countries like India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and other, I think it's incredible. And many people, unfortunately, back in India and in Pakistan, ignore this fact. We have, of course, Christophe Jaffrelot, who has written more than 27 books on India, 7 on Pakistan, and you have collaborated with him, you have written books with him, and you also have written a lot of books. So do you agree with this line that Paris is the center of India, of the world?
No, not really. I mean, we're just trying to bring our little contribution. But obviously, most scholarship on India, on South Asia, comes from the subcontinent itself. And we've drawn inspiration from, I mean, generations of Indian historians, sociologists, political scientists, anthropologists. Now they're scattered also across the world, across the US in particular, where increasingly their scholarship is being threatened. And I think France has been, I mean, it's been playing its role, but it's, a marginal contribution in regard to the vast amount of scholarship on South Asia.
Right. Nevertheless, I have a question regarding the importance of Europeans writing on India and Pakistan and why it is essential and different. We will get into that a bit later. But to present to you formally, you work at the CNRS, which is Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, as a senior research professor uh, at CERI, which is Centre de Recherche Internationale, SciencePo. You have authored, of course, the book Karachi, Order, Disorder, and the Struggle for the City. And this is the book that we will mainly discuss. But not just this, because you also have written a sequel to this, which is Gunpoint Capitalism. Before that, you have also co-edited the book Muslims in Indian Cities with Christophe Jaffrelot. You also have written Armed Militias of South Asia and Shared Sacred Sites in South Asia. And there's one more book that's Proud to Punish the Global Landscapes of Rough Justice. Is this a fair introduction?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
It's not complete, I'm sure, but I think for the moment this should suffice. Um, I have also one question to you about your linguistic skills because I know you learned Urdu. Was it at Inalco?
Yeah, so I studied Hindi, Urdu at Inalco for a few years. And then I lived in Delhi for 6 years, where in the context also the collective book you mentioned that I co-edited with Christophe Jaffrelot on Muslims in Indian cities. I tried to better my skills in Urdu at the time in Delhi.
Okay, तो हिंदी उर्दू में बात कर सकते हैं.
कर सकते हैं.
Okay. Uh, but I've also wanted to stress this because in the book you have massively used Urdu as such. You cited different poems, their importance, and we will get to it later. But language seems quite central to your research, not just as a tool, but also to understand the people and the country and the history. So I think that's really worth mentioning. What I found important in this book is this approach. It's very methodical. It is well researched. It's clinical. It's engrossing, captivating. And importantly, you have given a conclusion at the end of every chapter, and that kind of summarizes what we read. And I really like this. Uh, Before we start the interview, I must tell why this interview is important for me. Because as you can guess, Pakistan is a taboo word in India. We don't talk much about it. And whatever is talked, mostly is in the negative sense. It is often talked through the official Indian establishment or the state. It's their narrative. Uh, and it kind of prevents us from trying to understand the Pakistani people, the society, their problems. They perhaps have a bit more idea about India through the Indian movies and films and music than in the other way. But in any case, I think it's quite vital for me that we know each other well. And I will give you an instance because being in Paris, there's also luxury of meeting people from different countries, and I have some Pakistani friends. And few months and before, I think few years before, I was surprised that many of them did not know what was a dosa and an idli, which is quite a pity because there are some decent Tamil restaurants here. And what's good also is that in Paris we get some mangoes from not just from India but also from Pakistan, which is not possible there. So in this discussion, we will try to make constantly some corollaries to India-specific references so that it's easy for them to follow. And also, I believe, lastly, that it's important that academic writing comes out of the books and research institutes, and it's meant that lay people can understand and follow it. Now, sorry for this long introduction and justification for this interview. And this is also because, as you confirmed to me, this is for the first time we will be talking about this book to the Indian audience. So thank you again. My next question is why this book and why the idea of the city to study the city of Karachi?
Well, when I started working on Karachi in the early 2000s, the city was coming out from an already long sequence of conflict, of militancy, of various kind, which started really in the mid 80s. Maybe we'll come back to it. And in the course of those conflicts, Karachi got the reputation, which I think was not entirely fair, of being one of the most dangerous and most violent cities on earth. At the time when I studied my research, this was clearly not the case. There was a lull in violence. And I was concerned about these assumptions, making Karachi, as it was often nicknamed, the Beirut of South Asia, later on the Colombia of South Asia, etc., etc. What I saw, and the more I researched the city, the more I investigated the roots of this violence, its impact, its imprint on the social and political fabric in the city, the more it seemed to me that indeed violence was central to the fabric of the city, but it was also to some extent contained, regulated, and this was not a city on the verge of chaos, or even if it had at some point been on the brink of civil war, it never really entirely fell into the abyss. And for me, this was the initial enigma to understand actually why the city was not more violent than it could have been.
Right. I happened to watch an interview that you gave to the Pakistani podcast channel, the Pakistan Experience, talking about this interview. And in that interview, you replied by saying that you found a bit boring the narrative about the city, which concentrated mostly on its jihadi aspects or the importance of the army, perhaps not only about the city, but in general about Pakistan. And you wanted to explore more about the social, cultural, historical, political aspects of the city. You also make constantly, you keep in the book references to other zones, conflict zones in the world, including Brazil, the favelas you talk about, the Colombia case you talk about. You, in fact, also mentioned about the Gilets Jaunes, the Yellow Vest manifestation. So, how do you look at this kind of expansion of the example of Karachi to other places?
As you pointed out, when I started this research in the early 2000s, indeed, Pakistan was all too often, and that only increased after the events of 9/11, 2001. It was often reduced to, I mean, the importance of the army, its collusion with jihadis, emphasizing Pakistan as a center of international terrorism, In Karachi, at least, the jihadis and Islamists more generally were never a serious political force to reckon with. After 9/11, they did take a hold in the city. They organized a campaign of militancy that really disrupted the city, but they never became a central major force in political or even in territorial terms in the city. They were just one of the many stakeholders, one of the many parties to the conflict. So what I tried to do was to assess the much larger configuration that was at play, its historical roots, the fact that the most, and what intrigued me was that the most violent actors in the city were actually not religious organizations, but secular forces, which at the time, incidentally, were very much supported by the West. So there was here an anomaly in comparison with what was assumed to be the center of conflict in Pakistan. And on the other part, I mean, from its inception, this project was comparative. This is the way we understand political science at my institute, CERI in SciencePo. Even when we do case studies, we understand these case studies as inherently comparative in the sense that they are inspired by transversal questions, by our readings, by the everyday discussions we have. This is a research institute where all my colleagues work on various areas of the world. So it's also on an everyday basis. We exchange, we influence each other. And so from the very beginning and all along its course, all this research on Karachi has been trying, while catching the singularity of Karachi, to make it a case of something much larger.
Yeah, and I guess your work in India must have also helped you in this comparison. Uh, but to also to make a comparison of Karachi with Pakistan, extrapolation of your observations, to what extent that's credible or correct?
In a way, Karachi, I mean, has a specific history in the history of Pakistan, a history which incidentally is very closely linked to India. I mean, if we return to the terrible aftermath of partition, um, when hundreds of thousands of so-called muhajirs, so migrants who migrated in particular from the United Provinces, currently Uttar Pradesh, or the Deccan around Hyderabad. I mean, the arrival, the massive influx of this Urdu-speaking population, not only created a major urban housing crisis in Karachi for the years to come, way up until the early 50s, but it also entirely changed the ethnic, cultural, linguistic outlook of the city. From a city which was essentially Sindhi, where, I mean, trade in particular was largely dominated by Hindu trading elites. Um, Almost overnight, the outlook of the city dramatically changed, and Karachi became a Urdu-speaking city. Not only, it had many other communities, of which maybe we'll talk later, but the arrival of this Urdu-speaking population with roots in India, which remained very much attached to its places of origins in India. You mentioned Urdu poetry, but the fact, for instance, that many of the Urdu-speaking poets had their takhalus, which was still, so their pen name still referring to their place of origin, Delavi, Amrovi, etc., showed also this persisting attachment of the city's Urdu-speaking population, especially its cultural elites, to their homeland, to their place of origin, at least in India. And then the politics of Karachi changed, even if it was related to major issues in Pakistan, federalism, army interventions. It had a peculiar color linked to those demographic changes.
Yeah, and in fact, when we read your book, you also mentioned that many of the colonies in Karachi, I don't know if today that still exist, but had references to the cities of origin like Bangalore colony and other, if I remember, Bihari.
Of
So
course.
that's quite interesting. But since we're talking also about this link with India, could you tell us about the Bombay, the city of Bombay, which is often compared with Karachi? Are there similarities, differences? We can also compare Shiv Sena with MQM. Uh, how would you respond to this comparison?
Well, clearly, I mean, there are two sorts of cousin cities, you know. I mean, Delhi and Lahore sharing a political, architectural history, a similar cultural outlook. They've been cities, I mean, similarly affected by partition. In the same way, there is a form of connivance between Bombay and Karachi. They were part, I mean, administratively under the Raj until the 30s, part of the Bombay presidency. So there is that already historical administrative legacy. There was already in the colonial period a circulation of trading elites in particular, traders, bankers circulated. Some communities like the Memons from Bombay and Kathiawar circulated from the west of India to Karachi already in the 1930s. All the major trading houses in Bombay had often branches in Karachi. So these links were already there before partition, but they obviously, with the migration of, I mean, the vast majority of the Memon population in particular, um, who arrived from Bombay, who had their own trading practices that they brought to Karachi, and as I said, it also changed the outlook of the city. Then the post-colonial history of Karachi, you mentioned Shiv Sena. I mean, the parallel is obviously striking. You have a similar brand of ethnic politics, which took a more religious coloration in Bombay than in Karachi. But in many ways, the xenophobia, the militancy, the engagement, the rooting in the city of Shiv Sena and the party that came to dominate Karachi's politics from the mid 80s, the Mohajir Qawmi movement, so the national Mohajir movement, then renamed the Muttahida Qawmi movement, so the United National movement in the late 90s, had very, very strong similarities.
Okay. I will take you back now to the question I mentioned in the beginning. It's about the approach of the Anglo-Saxon writers, commenters, political commenters on India, Pakistan, and if you could distinguish them with the Latin researchers like you. Do you, because Britain has as a colonizer, ex-colonizer, has a different legacy, which France or the French authors do not really have with India. So do you find certain subtleties or differences when you look at this research done by the Latin professors?
I don't think I would call them Latin. I don't think there's a cultural difference. Maybe in Pakistan, more than the colonial legacy, which was, I think, quite important for my research, was the fact that I was not American, which in fact was much more important than the fact, that I was not British. I mean, in the early 2000s, post 9/11, being a foreign scholar in Pakistan, I mean, if you were not American or Israeli, things, I mean, could happen. So in a way, I mean, I think even the British legacy would have been something manageable. But the fact of being French, I mean, I seemed more neutral. I was not directly associated with the US. The fact that France diplomatically also took a stand against the invasion of Iraq, for instance. This made us seem a bit different and offered some protection and some acceptability. How did that affect my perception, the way I conducted research and wrote? I mean, that's harder to say, especially considering that I mean, I don't believe in methodological nationalism. I don't think there is a French way to engage with the world. And in any case, I mean, much of our reading, much of our collaborations, have been international. I mean, there's an internationalism of academia which doesn't fit very well with the idea that we operate under national banners.
Right. Yet, I would argue that since you said that a lot of major writing is done by this in the subcontinent by people by Indians and Pakistanis, and yet when you read books like your book and of Christoph, we see a difference, and which I could highlight as in terms of curiosity, in terms of rigor, in terms of approach. It could also be related to the availability of resources, material and otherwise. Do you agree with this difference, which is inherent?
No.
No.
No, I mean, as I said, how much, I mean, earlier work, for instance, on Karachi, which was, published by Nicolas Hunt, for instance, by Oscar Verk. I mean, so Nicolas Hunt, who was a British anthropologist, Oscar Verkaik, who is a Dutch anthropologist. All this was published in English. There was virtually, I mean, Michel Boivin had been contributing some work on Karachi at the time, but there was very little scholarship, French scholarship that I could rely on. And for me, my major inspirations were foreign scholars who had been writing on the city. It was work also by Pakistani scholars, sometimes teaching abroad. People like Kamran Azhar, for instance, have been, I mean, huge influences. Um, so no, I mean, I don't really define myself as a French scholar.
Okay, fair enough. Just a last question on this topic, and I keep asking this question also to Christoph, um, is about why don't we see Indians or Pakistanis writing about France, Italy, Germany, or other cities as extensively as Christoph has done or you have done? What would you, first of all, do you agree with this argument? And if yes, what could be the possible reasons?
Well, again, I mean, I think urban studies, I mean, is a much internationalized, discipline. Again, I mean, if I look at Karachi, and there was really a Dutch urban school around Jan van der Linden or people around him who were more into urban planning issues, who were doing things very similar to what the Orongi pilot project would do around people like architect Arif Hassan. Um, so again, I mean, in Karachi, I mean, there's been so much scholarship on the urban around people like Arif Hassan, around, I mean, the Karachi Urban Lab right now. So there's a glorious tradition, which was a bit different from what I was doing because very often these were more technical issues, which were more committed to development planning. But I could rely on that. So again, on the contrary, I think the French were, quite late comers to that scholarship.
Yeah, okay. But frankly, I would love to read writings by Indian and Pakistani authors on France and other countries. Equally, that would be equally interesting. Now, moving
But
on.
just on that question, I mean, the problem is, um, I don't think it's a lack of ambition on their part. It's a lack of finances. It's a lack of facilities. It's a lack of, I mean, difficulties of accessing, of getting granted visas. The fact that European universities were until recently not particularly welcoming. Most of the teaching was in French. So I think the structural reasons. I don't think it's out of a lack of interest, but it's structural, obstacles, many of which come from European governments.
Yes, we indeed mentioned the lack of resources could be a possible reason, and you confirm that. But I think it needs to be told that your book is published in French as well as in English, so two languages. Now, moving on, since we mentioned about the importance of poetry in the Karachi narrative, I have few examples from your book, and I will cite them, and I will then ask you to respond to it. You mentioned that poetry was central to this Urdu-dominated city, and you also gave an example of when the refugees came from India. Often in their application, they would cite a Mirza Ghalib's poem, or other poetic expressions. You also related it with the self-expressionist movements of the 1930s, how that could have been also one influence. And you also talked about poetry as being an intoxicant. For example, you said the poetry discussed here is therefore irreducible to political imagery or to the radical alibi of an otherwise opportunistic party, which is MQM. It is instead a form of politics by itself, where the intoxicating power of words meets the equally mesmerizing beauty of war. I think that kind well summarizes. But I will mention two other aspects, and then I will stop and invite your comment. You identified two forms of politics, and which made use of the poetry and the politics by MQM. One was salvation of the Muhajir nation, and you say in a more complex way, it points at the MQM's simultaneous practice of two seemingly opposite forms of politics, one existential, devoted to the salvation of the Muhajir nation through an endless fight of epic proportions against tyranny. And the second, you say, is about restoration of Muhajir rights, and one more earthly, centered on the restoration of Muhajir's rights. Yeah, so in general, comment on the use of poetry in the politics of Karachi.
Well, what I try to suggest is indeed the place of poetry in everyday life, in everyday politics in Pakistan has been absolutely central. And it has, I mean, obviously it's lost a bit of its appeal over the past decades. I mean, you mentioned these applications where refugees would add, a few couplets by Mirza Khalib in order to impress and press their case. I'm not sure that this is something that people would do today with the administration. It's also that, I mean, the high cultured, very Persianized version of Urdu that maybe Urdu speakers would be familiar with, at least in the middle and upper classes and castes in the early 50s, that has gradually disappeared. Yet at the same time, poetry remains very much part of the everyday language of politics, and in particular of the language of mobilization and contestation. So even I mean, during TV discussions, during TV shows, you'll find media personalities, politicians, reading couplets of Iqbal, of Ghalib, of the more transgressive, I mean, oppositional poets like Fez, um, Ahmed Faraz, Habib Jalib, which remain, I mean, so central to the language of protest in Pakistan, or they'll just recite couplets of their own. But you also find in everyday life people quoting poetry here and there. There are indeed two major ways to quote poetry in these everyday interactions. One is to invoke the theme of resistance, martyrdom, the theme of Karbala, which remains so central to the imagination of politics and especially protest politics. This is what the MQM had done. It was constantly playing with this theme of Karbala to mobilize its people and give an epic dimension to its struggle. And then there's a more mundane way, which is indeed to press grievances, to claim rights, which is also a way to give a certain weight to these claim-making enterprises.
You mentioned Zalil Habib Zalil, I'm confused.
Habib Jalib.
Habib Jalil, right? And his famous poem, Dastur. And there's also Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Hum Dekhenge. These two poems were largely recited during the anti-citizenship law in India a few years before, as you might know. Yeah. There's also this book which is quite famous in India, is by Fatima Bhutto, that's Songs of Blood and Sword. And we see also this poetic title and confirmation of what you just said. You have cited in the book several different small poems by, for example, Res Amrohvi, Zishan Sahil. Would you mind to recite a small poem if you remember?
No, I don't. I'll spare your viewers, and I don't have, I mean, any couplets right now. But
Okay.
I'd like to, I mean, if your viewers are interested, I mean, I'd really encourage them in particular to discover the poetry of Zishan Sahil, who is in particular, I think, a
Mm.
particularly important original avant-garde poet of the mid-90s, in particular in Karachi, who died prematurely in his prime, and who, unlike the greater poets, the more well-known poets that you mentioned, was really a chronicler of everyday life.
Mm.
And in a book devoted to Karachi itself, in the midst of the conflict in the mid 90s, really provided a chronicle of everyday turmoil in Karachi like no other writer did.
Yeah, I would still insist to recite a small couplet that you mentioned in the book of Reis Amrovi, 9th May 1948. It was published in Junk. Please forgive me for my bad potential pronunciation of Urdu, but it goes like this. इस शहर में आशिया है अंका दिल सख्त यहाँ उलझ रहा है पगड़ी की ताली तालिब है घर के बदले पगड़ी में मकान उलझ रहा है which means there is no shelter in the city of Karachi. The heart is in great turmoil. When our immediate concern is to preserve our dignity, how will we manage to find a home? Yeah. Thank you. And moving on now, we will do some serious complex work now that starts. Some acronyms because there are many in this book, and I think it's important that the audience they get a chance to have a glimpse at it. So this is the first page of the acronym, and this is the second one. You can come back to this video and refer. But I think it's not all that. We also have some other interesting maps and charts and tables that you included in this book. So I will just I propose to share them one by one. There are two of them, and I will ask you your comments. I took these two maps from internet, from the Reddit website, so that back in India, people could have an idea about the ethnic composition of Pakistan. Do you agree with this map?
Yes, broadly, yes.
Yeah, broadly, right. So we should identify broadly five nationalities in ethnic nationalities in Pakistan. One is from Sindh, and you have Karachi here with a huge population of Muhajirs. You have Baluchistan, so Baluch from there. You have, of course, Punjab, and I would say Pashtun, and then there are uh, other embedded sects perhaps there. And this is a more detailed view of that. So that's one. Yes, city map. I think that's also interesting for people back in India to have a look at the city of Karachi. And you have mentioned industrial ports and industrial areas, ports and other places. Just if you have any memories, any comments, you're welcome to comment.
Well, as you can see, I mean, Karachi really is an urban sprawl that really, I mean, the city is historically developed along the bay around the harbor.
Yeah.
It was a major entrepot city until until independence. It had very little, almost no industries until 1947. So all these industrial areas that we see, which came to redefine also the outlook and the economic importance of Karachi, were all developed in the peripheries of the city after partition.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And you mentioned about the industrial part, and of course, that's the major concern of your next book, I mean, which is already published, and we will perhaps get a chance to talk about it as well. Moving on, I think, yes, we could talk about the different languages of Karachi. So this will also give a glimpse about the ethnic composition. And you have broadly shown here how the proportion of the Urdu-speaking Muhajirs is reducing, while those of Punjabis and Pashtuns and Sindhis is increasing over the years. What else? I have also the share of population and the share of migrants into the population of Karachi. And we see here the population has increased quite a lot. And you have almost 2 millions of migrants in 1998, uh, right? Since we talk about the population, here's the spike we see in the migration after 1947. It's 161%. There was one in 1861 and again in 2011. Then now a very sordid picture. It's about the killings in Karachi. We have in 95 a huge spike, 1742 casualties, and then again in 2013. And I'm sure things have changed because your book was published in 2014. So this is restricted to until 2013, this data. I have now the next topic is about could you tell us about the Muhajirs, this if etymological explanation of this word, and the fact that they were urban elites from India, whose language was chosen as a language of official language of Pakistan. So in a way, they had an upper hand in terms of getting access to education and jobs, especially. And yet, there was a feeling of being discriminated, which was gradual perhaps, and which led to the Muhajir nationalism. So could you tell us about this Muhajir movement and the historical background?
Yeah, well, I mean, importantly, the Muhajirs, I mean, so Urdu speakers who migrated to Pakistan after partition were labeled Muhajirs, which initially was an appreciative term. It referred, so it literally means migrants, refugees, but it refers to a glorious episode of Islamic history where when the Prophet moved from Mecca to Medina, and thus at the time of the Hijrat, and so the Muhajirs are those who have done the Hijrat in the glorious company of the Prophet. So that term refers to that history, defines also a relation of interdependence and hospitality between the Muhajirs, the migrants, and the Ansars, or those who welcome them and grant them hospitality. So the idea for the first Pakistani political authorities and administrative authorities who used the term was also to grant a veneer of legitimacy and religious legitimacy in particular to that relationship, especially because very early on some tensions emerged between the indigenous population of West Pakistan and this massive influx of migrants from India. So these tensions are where there were some tensions from the very beginning around housing, jobs, around the perception that in fact this population was benefited from preference from the Pakistani state. And then things started changing already from the late 50s when the capital was shifted from Karachi to Rawalpindi and then to Islamabad in the 60s. At that time, the fact that the political capital was in Karachi made it easier for Muhajirs, not only in the bureaucracy, but also in the economy, for all businessmen to have access to political power. And it's really through that entrenchment of economic, political, administrative, bureaucratic power that the Muhajirs came to dominate the early years of Pakistan. That started changing from the 50s, and then from the late 60s, early 70s, we see a rise of Sindhi nationalism in Sindh itself, especially, I mean, under the leadership of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And we see a gradual, after the arrival to power of Bhutto, we see, I mean, flaring up of tensions. The first linguistic riots between Sindhis and Muhajirs happened in Karachi in 1972. And gradually, Bhutto will introduce also quotas in the bureaucracy, opening it up, making it more representative, and in particular to its core constituency, which was made of Sindhis. So this really fueled the sentiment among Urdu speakers that they were being discriminated against. But let's emphasize one thing: Muhajirs were not all elite. Many of, I mean, the vast majority of Muhajirs were actually artisans, working class. They also worked at the time in factories, in small workshops. So all these were not elite, and they became. It's also that lower middle class that became the backbone of Muhajir nationalism when, from the late 70s onwards, a group initially of student activists reappropriated the term Muhajir, which by then had become derogative, and made it a source of pride and a source of unity to mobilize against their perceived enemies and to claim new rights towards the state.
Right. You also talked about the MQM and how it was, you used the terms kingmaker and also the king breaker of the city. You also talked about its capacity to order the disorder, and with the two meanings of the word. One, it is to order the disorder, but also to tame it, the capacity. And we also saw that MQM changed its name. It became Muttahida Koyami movement. So that was its capacity to transform, and you highlighted it, saying that it could adapt to the changing situations. And it also wanted to widen its spectrum and not just limit it to Muhajirs. So how would you comment on the MQM's capacity to transform?
So initially, as I briefly mentioned, Muhajir nationalism really crystallized around student activists at the University of Karachi in the late 70s, when the founder of MQM, Altaf Hussein, was studying. He started this small group called the All Pakistan Muhajir Student Organization, or the APMSO, which at the time didn't have much influence. It didn't really pick up for one reason in particular, because it didn't have enough weapons. You must know that, I mean, in those days, these are the late 70s, early 80s, Karachi is flooded with weapons, which have been allegedly lost in transit going to Afghan Mujahideen. Um, so every student organization in the city which competes for control of the campuses, but also of certain turfs across the city, all of them are armed, or at least every student group that has some stakes in the city is heavily armed with Kalashnikovs, sometimes even heavier weapons. And the MQM is a latecomer. At the time, it's under the protection of other organizations, and it will be basically kicked out of the campus. And it will really return. It's such a failure that Altaf Hussein himself moves to the US, becomes allegedly a taxi driver in Chicago for a while. And so all seems lost for Muhajir nationalism. And then the situation changes. He returns to Pakistan in the mid 80s, then allegedly with the support of the so-called deep states and the dictatorship of General Zia, in order to counter both the Islamists of the Jamaat Islami and Sindhi nationalism, allegedly receives support. But this is not the only explanation for the rise of this formidable force. It's also that the city itself has changed, new conflicts have emerged. I mean, the Afghan war has not only brought weapons, it's brought drugs, money, a new Pashtun, I mean, criminal organizations that are emerging. And the MQM will reinvent Mohajer nationalism as a form of muscular nationalism that will give both pride and weapons to the Mohajer population. And it's gradually from the mid-80s onwards that it will become a formidable force, which at the same time draws its power from the urns because it wins every elections that it contests, whether local, regional, national, from the mid-80s onwards. And at the same time as it plays the card of democracy and legalism, it also plays the card of mayhem. Regularly, it calls to Hartal. So these days of general strike, it can close the city at will. Only one call from Altaf Hussein, and the city will entirely close down. This will be followed by ethnic riots, which are engineered by the MQM. So it's this capacity, but at the same time as it has this capacity to order violence, it can also call to the end of violence, which is this capacity to order disorder and to control it at will, which makes it so powerful and unpredictable at the same time. But this strategy also shows its limits because electorally the party cannot expand beyond its two major strongholds in Sindh, in urban Sindh, which are Karachi and Hyderabad. And then from the late 90s, after a long sequence of heavy repression from the state, it tries to expand its electoral base beyond the Mahathir community. This will never really succeed.
Yeah, and there's a funny mention in the book where you amusingly say that Altaf Hussein was also called Hartal Hussein because of his capacity to order hartals at will. But the reference you made about the influx of weapons, because one is tempted to compare India with Pakistan, and why there is such ubiquitous presence and easy access to arms. Can we, at least to some extent, hold responsible United States for this situation in the 1980s or 70s, yeah, during the war in Afghanistan?
Yeah, it's the US, it's the Saudis, it's all the Western, I mean, capitalist bloc that supports the Afghan Mujahideen who are branded as heroes at the time. It's also, I mean, the so-called deep state, the Bari Sarkar, as they call it in Pakistan, I mean, at the time, General Ziaul Haq is in power, at the helm of its power. The inter-services intelligence, the ISI, orchestrates this transport of weapons with the CIA. And many of these weapons, I mean, huge loads of weapons will be lost in transit on the way and will either be hijacked by Pakistani agencies or by several intermediaries along the way. Karachi, with its ports being the major international ports of Pakistan, many of these weapons consignments arrive through Karachi's port and will be hijacked from the port of Karachi itself.
Yeah, just few words, more words about Altaf Hussein. He is in London since 1992, right? And you give instances in the book that even from there, he very closely manages what's happening in the city. And you gave an instance where you were interviewing someone and there was a death of a person in the city, and there was a call to the unit head of MQM from London before the news had spread in the city. So that kind of gives an example of how deep is this influence. But I was also looking at the internet, and there are some very recent proclamations and demands by Altaf Hussein. One of them was surprising to me, was a demand for the Sindhu Desh, where he wanted a separate country for the Muhajirs plus the Sindhis. So how do you explain this demand, which enlarges the scope of this new nation and also accommodates Sindhis in it?
This has been, I mean, an old call from sections of the Mohammedan nationalist movement, which has always maintained an ambivalent relationship with Sindhi nationalism. In a way, after all, I mean, the Muhajirs live in Sindh. Karachi, Hyderabad are in the Sindh province. Very few Muhajirs speak Sindhi up until now, but there has been repeated attempts to build a coalition with Sindhi nationalist elements. I mean, as I briefly mentioned earlier, in the late 70s, early 80s, when Altaf Hussein and his colleagues were only students at the University of Karachi, and they had no weapons, it's initially through Sindhi nationalists that they got their first weapons, that they got their first training, because at the time Sindhi nationalists were already had a long, strong experience in terms of weapons handling, and so there was this attempt to build a form of Sindhi nationalism that would accommodate both Sindhi speaking and Urdu speaking nationalism. So this project of Sindhudesh has been off and on been agitated by MQM. How genuine was it? I don't think it was very serious on the part of MQM. I think it was more a matter of rhetoric. And I think today, even more than ever, especially considering that Altaf Hussein, I mean, has been very much alienated from Muhajirs. I think he's lost much of his appeal to Urdu-speaking Karachiites. In any case, I mean, the MQM Pakistan, I mean, has been very much marginalized in Pakistan politics since for the past decade or so.
Okay, fair enough. So moving on, your book has some dedicated chapters of, and I will read the titles because we won't get time to go and visit each of them. But yet, so the second chapter, and I will jump to it, it's about the student movements that you talked about and how they were linked or transformed them into political parties. And we can give examples of the APMSO for the MQM, PSF initially for PPP party. Then the chapter is about Muhajirs have arrived and we have talked about them. But the two important chapters of which we haven't talked much about them, and I would like us to comment on it. The It's about the bandits of the Leari. Leari is it the correct pronunciation? Leari part of the city, and the last one is the jihad, rise of jihad in Karachi. So before I invite your comments on this, I found it very interesting that in the book you shared this graph, and I will share it with the audience about the different groups, warring groups and gangs of Karachi. And yeah, could you tell us a bit about this underworld of Karachi, which influences still the politics
Okay.
there?
Yeah, it's a complex graph. Seeing it after many years, I realized that visually I could have probably have done better. But the point was really to show that there is a long history of gang rivalry in that particular neighborhood. I mean, here you need to say a word about that neighborhood, Liari, which is a really poor working class neighborhood, which is part of the old indigenous city right next to the port, and which today has become a degraded inner city, which is one of the poorest, most neglected areas of Karachi, and which for a while also became its most violent, degraded place. The location of the neighborhood is important to understand how certain forms of criminality developed there from the 50s and 60s onwards, because this was a place of contraband, which arrived from the ports in particular. And it's also adjacent to the wholesale markets of the city, where part of these contraband goods would be sold. Then, when Bhutto closed down when alcohol was banned, when gambling was banned, Liari also became a place famous for its illicit gambling dens and illicit places selling alcohol. So from there, but at the time, this was still petty criminality. When there were criminal rivalries, they were essentially settled with knives. And it's really, again, with the impact of the Afghan jihad, with the fact that so many weapons and heavy weapons arrived in the city, that these criminal rivalries really escalated into gang wars. And again, the state played a role in it. Very often, these gang wars were also proxy wars between political rivals. The MQM was suspected to suspect one group against the group that was supported by the PPP. The army itself allegedly supported certain groups to counter the rise of Baloch nationalism in the neighborhood. So this made these gang rivalries extremely complex and deadly.
Yeah, I must tell the audience that when I read the book, people back in India are all impressed, but also in a negative sense about the underworld of Mumbai. And when I read things about Karachi, I think it's a very benign version of underworld what we had or have in Bombay or Mumbai. But I think one word also about Liari, and you would confirm it, is that it's apparently the only bastion of the PPP in that city, and the rest is to MQM. And Benazir Bhutto and others, even from Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, they had a massive following there. But that could be perhaps compared to the Bellari of for Congress in Karnataka, or more pertinently to Amethi or Raebareli in Uttar Pradesh. Uh, okay, now last chapter. I mean, for me, that's important. It's about the how in recent times the Taliban, Pakistan Taliban, has made some serious incursions into Karachi and has, in a way, beaten MQM at its own game. So, how would you explain that challenge to MQM, and what is the situation today, post 2014?
Well, I mean, Karachi is, even if it was, um, in terms of demographic majority, an Urdu-speaking city until recently, it is also the largest Pashtun city in the world. It has had, I mean, a very significant Pashtun migration from the northwest of Pakistan from the 1960s onward. And this migration only increased with conflicts in the northwest after 9/11, after repeated brutal military operations led hundreds of thousands of Pashtuns to move out of the northwest and become IDPs, internally displaced persons, in Karachi in particular. So a whole section of the city, particularly in the northwest of the city, but also pockets in the southeast, have become Pashto speaking majority areas. And these areas were provided fertile ground for various jihadi groups, and in particular for the Pakistani Taliban of the so-called Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan after its creation in 2007. So these some Taliban fighters would take shelter in the city initially, using their relation, using the ethnic composition of these neighborhoods to basically hide, regain some forces before going back to the major battlefields of the northwest. And then gradually, the Taliban, I mean the Pakistani Taliban, kind of consolidated its bases from the late, I mean in the late 2010s, and then started also competing against the MQM pro hegemony against over the city, and started launching attacks against MQM.
Thanks. Time is short, but I still wish that we give a glimpse to the audience about the different political alliances which the MQM made. And I think it's very interesting. I made a small compilation, and you will tell me if it's correct or not, of different major political alliances which the MQM made right since 1988. It's an example of outright opportunism or pragmatism at best. And so the first one is in 1988, MQM makes an alliance that's called Karachi Accord with Benazir. In 89, we have MQM supported the no confidence motion led by Nawaz Sharif against Benazir government, and that was failed. In 1990, you have Benazir Bhutto government dissolved by President Ghulam Ishaq Khan. And the reasons given were worsening law and order situation in Karachi and in Hyderabad. Later on, in 1990, you have, in the same year, you have MQM, which makes an alliance now with Nawaz Sharif, PML. 1992, you have Sindh Chief of Army Staff, Asif Nawaz, who sent army without Nawaz's knowledge and approval to crack down on the MQM. 1993, we have Nawaz Sharif, who was dismissed partly due to worsening law and order in Karachi, but PPP was reluctant to ally with MQM. MQM boycotted the elections. December 1994, you have withdrawal of army from Karachi. Yeah, that was the region, the cleanup operation apparently against MQM, and which led to escalation of violence. You have 1995, most violent post-colonial year of Karachi, 1742 people killed. In 1995, you have crackdown against MQM by Home Minister of Benazir, General Nasirullah Babar, massive encounters that took place. 1996, 20th September, you have Murtaza Bhutto, and you mentioned him as being hot-tempered, was murdered. Rumor attributes it to close aides of Benazir Bhutto. 1996, 5th November, dismissal of Benazir government by President Farooq Leghari. Main accusations were that acquisition by Benazir of a sumptuous villa in Surrey in UK, political manipulations in Punjab, possible involvement in the murder of Murtaza, increase in extrajudicial killings by police and rangers in Pakistan. In 1997, PML in alliance with MQM, and they formed a government. But then again, MQM withdrew support to the provincial government in Sindh. I'm reaching to an end. So, but still we have 1997, 1998, killings again shot up. 1998, September, killing of former governor of Sindh, Hakim Saeed by MQM. MQM withdrew support to Sharif. Sharif dissolved the assembly and proclaimed state emergency. Year 2000, law and order improved for the newspaper Herald, and it called it the City of Life, Karachi. MQM made an alliance with ANP. There was a conflict between them, 2002 and 2008 years, the Musharraf years, are meant good years for MQM alliance with them. 2008, MQM made post-Musharraf made an alliance with PPP. MQM withdrew support in December 2010, thrice in June 2011, and again in February 2013. And 2013, most violent year ever, 2507 killings. Sorry for this long summary, but I think it was important. Do you have any general comments about MQMs as a very mercurial, untrustworthy partner, and yet pragmatic and opportunistic in a way?
Yeah, it's what is fascinating about this party in its glory years that you presented. It's how it acted both as an oppositional movement, and it used the word Tariq, so movement, which has this connotation of subversion, of social mobilization, of being a transgressive force, and at the same time, a political party engaging with what is referred to pejoratively in Pakistan as paktibazi. So really petty politics, and it's that tension that never entirely left. Most militant parties, once they get to power, tend to play the game, become pragmatic, opportunistic, cynical. The MQM remains part of the MQM remained true to its educational politics of its student years, and that's I mean, you described it as a mercurial force. I mean, this is precisely its dual legacy that it never entirely broke away from, which made it so particular. But all this is now a thing of the past, and the MQM has really been cut down to size after 2015, when there was another massive paramilitary crackdown on the party, and this time the party never regained power after this.
Okay, thank you. We're now reaching the end of this interview, but I still have few last questions. Few questions, yeah. One is about the mention that you made in the book, and I think it could make a ring in the ears of the Indians. It's about the failure of the two-nation theory. And you cite one example or one argument given by MQM, saying that the fact that there were four nationalities, Pashtun, Punjabi, Baluch, and Sindhi, other than the Muhajirs, in a way is a proof of the failure of the two-nation theory. Uh, I would add perhaps two more and then request your comment. One would be the fact that more Muslims in 1947 decided at that time to stay back in India than those who chose to come to Pakistan. Second would be also the 1971 separation of Bangladesh. So does this count make three with these three reasons, or there are more to this?
Okay, I think you can't take the words of MQM for granted. When they criticized the two-nation theory, this was part of their theory, political rhetoric, and provoking the Pakistani state. Um, Besides, I mean, this was a rhetoric which has not really aged well in Pakistan, and today many people in Pakistan, including in the MQM's ranks, would say that the fate of Muslims in India, is validates the two-nation theory project, and that hopefully the Pakistani state was created to provide shelter to at least a section of Indian Muslims. So I think recent developments since the arrival to power of Narendra Modi has kind of regenerated the two-nation theory and the Pakistani project. And in that sense, after decades of disillusions, in a way, Pakistan nationalism has grown, larger and stronger, very much thanks to Modi's government.
Yeah, I asked this question also to Christoph in one of the recent interviews I had with him. And I asked him, has the politics of Narendra Modi proved the two-nation theory of Jinnah right? How would you respond to this?
No, I mean, it's not my role to say who was right, who was wrong. I mean, I'm a social scientist. All I'm interested in is how the people I study, the people I work with, perceive it. What I see is among many of the Pakistanis I interact with, a sense of, maybe not, certainly not in Balochistan right now, but at least outside the most contested parts of the country where Pakistan nationalism is the most contested. Otherwise, there is, even if there is despair with the economic crisis, there is at least a sense that Pakistan provided a roof and a certain limited, however imperfect, protection to Muslims of the subcontinent.
Yeah, if you are interested, Christoph's answer, and it's a speculative one, but of course, was that this claim is counterfactual because the elites, Muslim elites in India, decided to go to Pakistan and not stay, and which means they left at the mercy of the Hindu dominance in the Muslims. Well, that could be possibly one reason. Now, I really wish to summarize your book, and I have made a small chart because the basic question, the important one which remains, is why Karachi is an order disorder. And as a summary, you asked two questions in the book, and one is How did armed conflicts become endemic in the city since mid-1980s? Second question, what spared Karachi a general conflagration despite repeated sequences of violent escalation accompanied by ethnic, political, and more recently, religious polarization? And you kind of give four answers to these questions. The first one is MQM's capacity to order disorder in both senses of the term that we discussed. That is a capacity to unleash but also to tame civil strife as well. Second, Karachi has been characterized since the mid 1980s by the inability of any actor to exert a complete domination over local politics and monopolize the means of coercion and the ability of one actor, the MQM, to dominate the game nonetheless. Third, the city's armed conflicts have been fueled but also moderated by a genuine yet unconsolidated democratic context, which saw the development in the shadow of military interventions, of an armed consociationalism, it's a difficult word to pronounce, regulating the tense relations between ethnic based and partly militarized political parties. And the very last, fourth, an important one, and I think this is the one which is very difficult for perhaps for the Indian audience to understand, is the role of state agencies and in particular of the army, whose repeated attempts to restore order through performances of legitimate violence, through the outsourcing of illegitimate violence, and through a politics of patronage, has had mitigated effects, both nurturing and moderating violent conflicts in the city. Yes, Laurent, how would you respond to these conclusions? Are they the same after, I don't know how, 10 more years that you wrote the book?
No, as I said, I mean, the situation has dramatically changed after 2015 because factor four, the role of state agencies, became prominent over all of the other factors. And suddenly, I mean, the army did something that it had not done before, which was to demilitarize everyone. And then, until then, the army had acted as a partial umpire, which was, arbitrating the conflicts of a city in a very partial way. This time, it went hard against everyone. So it went the hardest against the MQM, but it also went hard against, I mean, the gangsters of Yari, against Pashtun nationalists, against the jihadis, so much so that to a large extent, Karachi has become demilitarized, except as far as law enforcement agencies are concerned. I mean, it's become heavily policed, not only by the police, but also by the paramilitary rangers, by private security, by various forms. Many of the former um, muscle men of previous conflicts have become now, security suppliers, for instance, for industrialists, for traders. So there is still much muscle power at work, but there's no longer the time of militarized politics is over. And clearly, there are signs that this is not going to resume. It's now been 10 years
Mhm.
that there is on the surface peace in Karachi. I mean, once in a while, there's a bomb attack, but nothing compared the gun battles of yesteryear, the time when political parties could, have gun battles in the streets for several days. This is over, and I think this is not it's not here to resume. It's a new form of Karachi, new forms of violence, which are the ones that I described in the following book, which are more linked to a new brand of capitalism, which are emerging, either linked to industrial capitalism, but also increasingly to real estate. And it's also the formidable forces that are emerging around real estate actors, once again working in collusion with the army, which are now the structural violent forces in the city. So, in that sense, that peace is only superficial, and it's behind the surface. Social conflicts are still brewing, but less visible.
Thank you. Okay. I really wish I get a chance to talk to you about the next book, which is Gunpoint Capitalism. And we also briefly discussed the possibilities to see if it's translated into different languages, Indian languages as well. So let's see how we go. I have admired your book, and I really mean it. It's really an immersion into Karachi and Pakistan, and it really gives me more reasons to visit Karachi and Pakistan. But I also have a small critique about your book, and I hope you don't mind it, which is the language I found was very heavy, complex, but I think it's also the subject, which is. Do you have a small comment on that?
It's an academic book, so it's. I mean, as much as I enjoy discussing with you, with journalists, with everyone, the core of what we do is scholarship. So it is written in a certain way when we write essentially for our peers. I tried. I think the second book is a bit maybe different. It has more narrative elements to it. Um, but still, at the same time, it had a rather large circulation in Karachi, which kind of surprised me because it has not been written to reach a large audience. It's written essentially as an academic book. And I mean, I've been, delighted to see that it found an audience well beyond academia in Karachi at least, and I can only hope in India as well.
I'm not surprised at all because it's a very engrossing and enchanting book, I must say. I have a very last question now, and which is all this violence, when one reads your book and the scale and the extent of violence in Karachi and in Pakistan, it's very hard to even visualize, to imagine. Question would be, what effect of this prolonged exposure to violence has on the population of Karachi and Pakistan, but also on researchers like you, since you have covered the city and observed it since last more than 25 years?
Well, I'll be brief because this is a really large question. Karachiites, I mean, have learned to deal with violence. They've learned to engage with a form of normalcy of the abnormal. When on the surface, it could feel that they get on with their lives. I think this is the case of any population in the context of conflict. Life goes on to some extent in a bizarre and uncertain, unpredictable kind of way. Um, but life goes on in a way. Today, most Karachiites they want to forget this troubled past. They really don't want to revisit this. They want to shift to something else. And as far as I am concerned, I mean, I got to learn the rules of getting by as well. I didn't expose myself, unnecessarily. I mean, if you looked for trouble, you could always find it, obviously. But if you tried to respect some of the rules, to engage with the people, not to act, in a brazen kind of way, like some foreign journalists, trying to look for the spectacular, trying to meet dangerous people at dangerous times in dangerous places, obviously there would be a sanction. On my case, part of my investigation was also to learn through the people and also to avoid putting people I interacted with at risk. I don't think my own safety wasn't my only concern. My major concern, it should be the primary concern of any foreign scholar or journalist, which is not to put your local respondents, your local friends, your local informants at risk. And this is the kind of thing that we're also teaching our students, which is the basic of ethical work in such conflict zones.
Yeah, and I think if there's any or only region in India which could be compared to Karachi or Pakistan for this violence, I would say it is none other than Kashmir. Well, Laurent Guillet, a big thank you for accepting to talk to me, for talking to the Indian audience, and giving us such deep insight into Karachi and Pakistan at large. I look forward that your books are read not just in Pakistan but also in India and in France and everywhere. Thank you again.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye.